Long before Rome, before Egypt's pyramids, before even Stonehenge took its final shape, a civilization was already thriving between two rivers in what is now Iraq, and its people would go on to gift humanity some of its most fundamental inventions. This is the story of Sumer, one of the earliest known civilizations on Earth, a society that rose from mudflats and marshland to build the world's first cities, invent writing, and lay down ideas about law, mathematics, and time that we still use today, before ultimately collapsing under the weight of drought, war, and soil turned to salt. The land itself begins in the mountains of southeastern Turkey, where snow-capped peaks trap rain clouds and feed countless streams that eventually merge into two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These rivers carry with them fine mineral particles called silt, washed down from crumbling rock, and as they spill out across the flat desert plains of southern Iraq, they deposit this silt across the land, transforming an otherwise punishing, arid landscape into some of the most fertile farmland on the planet. It's a harsh place by any measure, with summer temperatures soaring past 50 degrees Celsius, unpredictable seasonal floods, and almost no natural stone or metal to be found anywhere nearby. Yet it was here, against every apparent disadvantage, that agriculture first flourished and cities first rose. Roughly 13,000 years ago, wandering hunter-gatherer bands in the surrounding hills discovered that seeds tossed onto rubbish heaps would sprout into the very plants they had eaten, and this simple observation sparked the idea of deliberate farming. Communities began to settle permanently, building granaries and mud brick houses, and by around 6500 BC, these early farming peoples, known to archaeologists today as the Ubaid culture, were pushing further down the river valleys into the harsh southern floodplain, digging irrigation canals to carry water to fields far from the riverbanks. Nobody knows exactly who these first settlers were or what language they spoke, but their innovations set the stage for something far larger. Two distinct peoples eventually came to dominate this land: the Akkadians in the north, who spoke a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic, and the Sumerians in the south, whose language remains one of history's great puzzles, since it isn't related to any other known tongue on Earth. Some historians have speculated the Sumerians might have arrived from elsewhere entirely, pointing to old myths about a fish-like being emerging from the sea to teach humanity the arts of civilization, and to the intriguing fact that Sumerian words for sophisticated urban professions, like scribe or winemaker, seem to be genuinely native to the language, while more basic labor terms were borrowed from earlier peoples. One especially compelling theory ties this to the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers caused global sea levels to rise dramatically, submerging a huge fertile valley at the head of the Persian Gulf, and possibly driving refugee populations northward over thousands of years, refugees who may have carried with them enduring legends of a catastrophic flood, a story that would later echo through Sumerian mythology and eventually find its way into the biblical account of Noah. Whatever their true origins, the Sumerians and Akkadians grew into a deeply intertwined civilization, sharing technology, trade, and culture even as they retained separate identities. Lacking stone or timber, these people became master builders in mud, forming bricks from river clay mixed with straw and baking them hard under the sun, while bundles of marsh reeds were woven into mats, baskets, and the frames of houses. They are credited with pioneering or refining the potter's wheel, the wagon wheel, the plow, and sailing boats, and they developed remarkably advanced mathematics, including a base 60 counting system that survives today in our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. The digging and maintenance of complex irrigation networks required organized labor, planning, and oversight, and many historians believe it was this very need for coordination that gave birth to the first organized states, with local rulers known as Ensi governing city-states centered around towering temple complexes. According to Sumerian tradition, the very first city was Eridu, founded somewhere around 5400 BC, an almost unimaginable 7,000 years ago, predating the Great Pyramids by nearly 1,000 years. Over the following centuries, a constellation of independent city-states rose across the floodplain, each defined by canals and boundary markers, most housing no more than a few thousand residents, in what appears to have been a relatively peaceful early period with little evidence of large-scale warfare or fortified walls. Then, around 3200 BC, came the invention that would change the trajectory of human history forever: writing. Sumerian scribes began pressing reed styluses into wet clay tablets, initially drawing simple pictures to record transactions like rations of grain or beer, and over time these pictographs were simplified and abstracted into wedge-shaped symbols, a script we call cuneiform. Eventually, these symbols came to represent sounds rather than whole objects, birthing the world's first writing system capable of recording not just inventories but language itself, thought itself, preserved and transmitted across generations. This breakthrough coincided with the explosive growth of the city of Uruk, which by the middle of the 4th millennium BC had become the largest urban center humanity had ever produced, home to tens of thousands of people surrounded by massive fortified walls, with distinct zones for housing, gardens, farmland, and temples. It was in Uruk that the legendary king Gilgamesh was said to have ruled, a figure whose adventures were later immortalized in the world's oldest surviving work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Daily life in these early cities was vivid and surprisingly familiar. Markets overflowing with lentils, dates, and pomegranates, workshops mass-producing pottery, bustling streets thick with the smoke of kilns, and taverns where people gathered to drink beer, of which the Sumerians brewed dozens of varieties, through long reed straws, grumbling about unfair bosses and empty pockets in proverbs that survive to this day. As Uruk's influence expanded, another city, rose to prominence at the mouth of the Euphrates, becoming a booming trade hub thanks to its access to the sea. Since the region lacked metal, timber, and precious stones, the Sumerians imported copper, tin, silver, gold, and cedar wood from as far away as modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, and even the Indus Valley civilization in South Asia, trading their abundant surplus of grain and manufactured goods in return. This wealth is vividly displayed in artifacts like the ornate mosaic panel known as the Standard of which depicts scenes of both warfare and peaceful daily life among the elite. But as the 3rd millennium BC progressed, this era of relative peace gave way to increasing militarization and rivalry between cities. The city of Lagash, having grown wealthy through raiding and slave trading, went to war with its neighbor Umma over disputed farmland, a conflict memorialized in brutal detail on a carved monument known as the Stele of the Vultures, showing soldiers trampling their enemies while vultures carry off severed heads. Lagash briefly built what some call history's first empire, but its harsh rule provoked rebellion, and the king of Umma, a man named Lugaltsagesi, rose up, crushed Lagash, and went on to claim dominion over the entire region between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. His triumph, however, was short-lived. Around the mid-24th century BC, a man of humble origins according to legend, a former royal cupbearer named Sargon, launched a daring surprise assault on Lugaltsagesi's capital, ultimately defeating him in battle and founding an entirely new empire centered on a city called Akkad. Sargon of Akkad is often remembered as history's first true empire builder, uniting Sumerian and Akkadian lands under centralized rule, promoting Akkadian as an administrative language, and reigning for over 5 decades. Yet his dynasty struggled to hold together the vast territories he had conquered, facing repeated rebellions from resentful Sumerian cities, and though his grandson Naram-Sin managed to restore stability for a time, adopting the more conciliatory title king of Sumer and Akkad, the balance between the two peoples was shifting permanently. as the widely spoken and more grammatically accessible Akkadian language steadily displaced Sumerian as the everyday tongue of the region. The empire's fortunes turned catastrophically during the reign of Sargon's great-grandson, Shar-Kali-Shari, when a mysterious global climate shift, now known to researchers as the 4.2 kiloyear event, brought severe and prolonged drought to Mesopotamia, causing crop failures and famine that weakened the state for well over a century. Seizing on this vulnerability, a nomadic mountain people called the Gudi swept down from the highlands, and after Shar-Kali-Shari's death plunged the empire into chaos. They overran and utterly destroyed the city of Akkad itself, so completely that archaeologists have never located its ruins. The Gudi proved far better at conquest than governance, neglecting agriculture, infrastructure, and even releasing livestock to roam freely across the countryside, deepening the famine they inherited. Eventually, a Sumerian governor named Uduhengel rose in rebellion, defeated the Gudi king Tirigan, and restored native Sumerian rule, ushering in a final glorious chapter, often called the Sumerian Renaissance, under the third dynasty of Ur. Its founder, a capable administrator named Ur-Nammu, standardized weights and measures, rebuilt roads and canals, wrote down one of history's earliest legal codes predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries, and constructed the towering stepped pyramid known as a ziggurat, a monumental structure at Ur that would have loomed 30 meters above the surrounding plains. Yet even as these achievements flourished, an invisible enemy was steadily undermining the foundation of Sumerian society: salt. Centuries of irrigation had gradually deposited mineral salts across the fields, and in this dry climate with little rainfall to wash them away, the soil grew increasingly toxic to wheat, forcing farmers to shift almost entirely to the more salt-tolerant barley, and crop yields fell relentlessly over generations. Compounding this slow agricultural decline, new waves of drought-driven migrants known as the Martu began pressing into Sumerian territory from the west, prompting desperate kings to construct an enormous defensive rampart nearly 300 kilometers long, longer than Hadrian's Wall in Britain, though it would ultimately fail to hold back the tide. The final Sumerian king, Ibbi-Sin, inherited a crumbling state besieged from every direction. As grain prices spiraled to 60 times their normal cost, provinces broke away one after another, and even his own trusted general betrayed him, seizing desperately needed grain shipments and declaring himself an independent king. In the end, the rising power of Elam, former subjects from the Iranian highlands, marched on the isolated capital of Ur, breached its walls, burned its temples, plundered its treasures, and dragged Ibbi-Sin away in chains to die in a foreign land, bringing a definitive end to the last unified Sumerian state. Survivors fled north in droves, gradually blending into Akkadian society and abandoning their ancestral language, which would never again be spoken in the streets and marketplaces, surviving only as a sacred, scholarly language preserved in temples for another 2,000 years, much as Latin endured within the churches of medieval Europe. The great cities themselves, Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, slowly crumbled into windswept mounds of mudbrick, their canals silting up, their ziggurats abandoned, until centuries later travelers would stumble upon these forgotten ruins and marvel at the mysterious inscriptions littering the ground, unaware they were gazing upon the remnants of humanity's first great civilization, a society that had given the world cities, writing, law, and mathematics, only to be swallowed at last by drought, salt, and time. Feel free to let me know if you'd like this trimmed down, expanded, split into sections with timestamps, or adjusted in tone for your specific channel style.